Hello everybody. In the next two videos we're going to look at moral non-naturalism, which is a form of moral realism. In particular we'll examine the version of non-naturalism defended by G.E. Moore. Moore's work on metaethics was really what kick-started modern metaethics, so there'll be some important material in this video and the next. First, let's remind ourselves of moral realism in general. Moral realism says that moral statements express propositions, so it's a form of cognitivism. Some moral statements are true. Moral statements are true or false in virtue of mind-independent properties of the world. So in other words, moral values are out there in the world. They're not just human constructions. If slavery is wrong, then it's wrong no matter what anybody thinks about it. If giving to charity is good, then giving to charity is good no matter what anybody thinks about it. Okay, let's think about some general benefits of moral realism. Why be a moral realist? Well, first of all, it accords with common sense. Moral realists like to point out that the common sense position is that there are moral facts in the world. This does seem to reflect how we use moral statements. David Enoch illustrates this by using what he calls the counterfactual test. He says, consider top hats. Top hats are unfashionable. Now ask, had we all worn top hats, had we all thought that top hats were cool, would it have still been the case that top hats are unfashionable? Well, of course not. The fashionability or otherwise of top hats depends on us. Then he considers the claim that smoking causes cancer. We know that this is true, so now ask, had we not believed that smoking causes cancer, had we thought it was harmless, would it still have been the case that smoking causes cancer? Yes, because the link between smoking and cancer doesn't depend on us. Enoch's point is that we can use this test to figure out whether or not we're realists about some area of discourse. So now think about moral claims such as slavery is wrong. I assume you all agree that slavery is wrong. So had we not disapproved of slavery, would slavery still have been wrong? Intuitively the answer is yes. This seems like the smoking example. So moral statements seem to work like factual claims. Second, moral realism accounts very well for the kind of the force that moral judgments have. For many people, morality seems to be more than just opinion. Imagine somebody saying that genocide is good or that slavery is perfectly acceptable. That would seem almost literally crazy. It would seem irrational and certainly incorrect. If something is a fact, then people are kind of rationally compelled to accept it. It's a fact that humans and chimpanzees evolved from a common ancestor. It's a fact that the Earth orbits the barycenter of the solar system. These claims have a rational force. It's not simply, you can't just reject them. Moral realists would say that moral judgments have a similar force. There's something rationally compelling about the claim that slavery is wrong. At least once you sort of learn all the details of slavery, what it sort of the effects it has on people. There's rationally compelling force to the claim that slavery is wrong, just as there is with the claim that humans and chimpanzees evolved from a common ancestor. Third, it standardly seems like we can make moral errors. It seems like I can be wrong about some of the views that I hold. Imagine somebody who really hates homosexuals because he thinks that his religion prohibits homosexuality. Now imagine that he changes his mind. Maybe he comes to reject his religion, or maybe he comes to think that actually his religion is more about tolerating different lifestyles and not hating people. Well, if you asked him to describe this change, he might say something like, I thought that homosexuality was wrong, but I was mistaken. This is a perfectly normal way of speaking. The moral realist has a straightforward account of this. We can make moral mistakes because there are moral facts, and you can get facts right or wrong. Fourth, and this is perhaps related to the other points, but societies seem to exhibit moral progress. An important point here is the convergence of moral values. Think about empirical claims such as the origin of life and humans. If you look at different societies, there are all sorts of different creation myths. But with the rise of modern science, these creation myths have given away to a story that's accepted by every educated person. The Earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago, life emerged about 3.8 billion years ago, For 2 billion years there were nothing but prokaryotes. Life evolved through a series of gradual changes by processes like natural selection, genetic drift, lateral gene transfer. Eukaryotes appear 1.8 billion years ago. Multicellular life gradually develops until 500 million years ago there's during the Cambrian a massive explosion of multicellular life, and so on. We can object to some specifics, but in its broad outlines everybody has come to agree on this story. People from all over the world, from all sorts of different countries, whatever the creation myths of their culture, as they become educated about the evidence, people come to agree on this story. So what we have here is convergence. What explains this convergence? The obvious explanation is that the story is true. It happened and it left evidence, and people converged on this story by reflecting on the evidence. Well, similarly, some people have argued that there is convergence on moral values. Peter Singer likes to talk about the expanding circle of moral concern. This is the idea that as human societies have developed, the group to whom we grant moral consideration has gotten wider. We include more things in the circle of moral concern. In the distant past, all that mattered morally was the immediate tribe, the 50 to 100 people that you lived with. Societies got more complex, and so did the moral circle. By the Roman era, for instance, Romans would care about other Romans in general. I think I've mentioned how Romans would frequently practice war rape. Raping people who weren't Romans was perfectly fine. They're not Romans, so who cares? But it would be unacceptable to rape another Roman. So the circle of moral concern had expanded to include the kind of whole ethnic culture. Moving into the modern era, people care about humanity in general. People attacked racism and slavery and fought for civil rights. Still more recently, we've seen attempts to expand the moral circle to non-human animals. So there's a trend towards ever-widening moral concern, and this seems to happen in pretty much every society. Almost all modern societies give some consideration to humanity in general, and many are starting to extend consideration to other animals. Other trends might be concern about equality, moving from very, very rigid feudal systems to capitalism to welfare states. There's concern for freedom, free expression, tolerance for different lifestyles. Punishment has been getting less harsh. We used to burn people at the stake and torture them, cut their hands off. Almost every country has become less brutal. So in many respects, it looks like there's been a convergence of moral views. The moral realist suggests that the best explanation for moral convergence is that people are coming to recognise facts in the world, just as is the case for convergence on scientific beliefs. It's not some kind of weird cosmic coincidence that everybody just happens to come to accept the same moral views. We're recognising moral facts. That's why we're converging. So those were some those are some initial considerations that motivate moral realism. Now, personally, I don't find any of them persuasive. Just to be very briefly, on the first argument, I disagree that moral realism is actually commonsensical, and I don't think it would make any difference if it was, because common sense is no guide to reality. The second and third arguments, I think, beg the question in favour of realism. They presuppose realism. And as for the fourth argument, convergence, I doubt whether there actually has been moral convergence in any substantial sense, and even if there has been, it can easily be explained in other ways. But I won't really delve into that in much more detail, because those are just some initial considerations. Those are some reasons we might want to be moral realists. I assume that moral realism is straightforward enough, but it comes in natural and non-natural varieties. So, on moral naturalism, the properties that make moral statements true or false are natural properties. Moral facts are natural facts. On moral non-naturalism, the properties that make moral statements true or false are, you guessed it, non-natural properties. Moral facts are non-natural facts. This distinction between natural and non-natural properties is a bit tricky. So let's think about some suggestions. How do we distinguish natural from non-natural properties? What's that all about? Well, first of all, we could say that natural properties are those are those properties that figure in a mature scientific description of the world. They are properties that we come to know about through empirical study. There are a couple of problems with this idea. For one thing, it's difficult to characterise exactly what science or a scientific description is. We'd want to cast the net pretty broadly here, so we'd want to include physics, chemistry, biology, but also softer sciences like anthropology, paleontology, psychology, even history. I mean, historians are clearly dealing with natural properties. But then it's not at all obvious that philosophy and ethics will get excluded. On a plausible way of looking at philosophy and science exist on a spectrum. Science shades into philosophy. This is kind of a sort of Quinean view of the relation between philosophy and science. There isn't really a strict distinction between them. Now, I'm sure that ethics has no place in physics and chemistry, but as we define science more broadly, it's not at all obvious that ethics wouldn't be included. Another problem is that this definition makes the distinction contingent on social practice. We can actually imagine scientists appealing to moral properties. A psychologist, in explaining why someone feels guilty, might say, he realised that his actions were evil. This is a straightforward appeal to a moral property. If psychologists decided to start talking in this kind of way, then moral properties would figure in scientific descriptions, and so would be natural properties. Now, perhaps you'd say it would be bad science for psychologists to explain things by appealing to moral properties. Maybe you're right. Indeed, I'd agree that psychologists shouldn't appeal to moral properties in their explanations, because I don't think there are any moral properties. But the point is, they could do. And if they did, then whatever the merits of appeals to moral properties, they would be part of scientific descriptions and hence would be natural properties on according to this definition. So, a second attempt is to say that natural properties are those that are directly or indirectly detectable through the senses. Chairs and mountains are directly detectable. Protons, genes, gamma rays, these are indirectly detectable because they have effects on things that are directly detectable. A problem here is that it could be the case that the fundamental stuff of the universe is just too small for us to detect in any way. Indeed, it's at least a logical possibility that there isn't any fundamental stuff at all, that things just get smaller and smaller and smaller, and there's no end to how small things get. Everything is made up of something else. There are no fundamental particles. In this case, there would be an infinity of things that would be totally undetectable and unknowable. But it seems to me we'd still call these things natural. They'd be natural things that we couldn't know about. Furthermore, arguably there are non-natural things that would be detectable by the senses. Some people claim that they can talk to God or talk to the souls of the dead. Some people claim to have seen ghosts and angels. So this doesn't seem to work either. A third suggestion is that natural properties are those that have a spatio-temporal location. They exist in space and time. This is quite appealing. It doesn't make natural properties contingent on social practice or contingent on what we can discover. So we include all that we need to, it seems. Furthermore, God and ghosts and angels, even if they have effects on our spatio-temporal world, are often said to inhabit other dimensions. So it seems to exclude the right things. Unfortunately, it maybe excludes a bit too much because presumably moral properties also exist in space and time. If I stab someone in the face, that would be morally bad, and the moral badness would presumably exist at the same spatial and temporal location as my action. Moral properties can be instantiated by particular actions at particular places at particular times. We don't want to say that moral properties are totally unconnected to the spatio-temporal world. So it's difficult to say exactly what non-natural properties are. I'm not really sure how to draw the distinction between the natural and the non-natural. But I hope you've got some idea of what it's supposed to be about. So with that distinction in mind, let's consider moral non-naturalism. The essential idea of moral non-naturalism is that moral properties are not reducible to natural properties. They're something over and above natural properties. Take the event of me stabbing somebody in the face. We could explain all of the natural properties of this event. This would take a long time. We explain all the positions of all the particles involved, all the fermions and bosons. We explain the exact energy use required for me to move the knife. We explain the mental states. I feel angry, the person I stab feels pain. We explain the blood loss, the exact amount of damage done by the stabbing, and so on. For the moral non-naturalist, this isn't the full story. We've left something out, because this event also has non-natural properties. It has the non-natural property of being morally wrong. The second essential idea is that moral properties supervene on natural properties. What does this mean? Well, we say that one set of properties, call them A properties, supervenes on another set of properties, call them B properties, just in case there can be no change in the A properties without a change in the B properties. To illustrate this, consider this image. It's a rectangle. This rectangle is made up of a particular arrangement of pixels. What we can say is that the shape, the rectangular shape, supervenes on the arrangement of the pixels, because you couldn't change the shape without changing the arrangement of the pixels. So to say that moral properties supervene on natural properties is to say that the moral properties can't change without some change in the natural properties. If the moral properties of two events are different, there must be some differences in the natural properties. Obviously, I wouldn't take this analogy sort of too seriously, because with the case of the shape and the pixels, the shape just is the arrangement of the pixels. You know, there's nothing. Once you've explained given the facts about the pixels, you've given all the facts there are about the shape. So in the case of the shape and the pixels, the shape isn't something over and above the pixels, as it were. So the point is here just to illustrate this supervenience relation. If you're not clear about supervenience, look it up online. You need to know what supervenience is if you're interested in philosophy. It's actually quite a straightforward idea, but you do need to know what it is. But the essential claim is that if two events differ in their moral properties, they must also differ in their natural properties. So take my stabbing someone in the face. The moral realist would say that this has the property of moral wrongness. Now imagine a possible world with exactly the same natural properties as our world. So I stab someone in the face for exactly the same reasons, it caused exactly the same amount of damage, and so on. Could the moral properties of my action be different? Could it be permissible or morally good? Well, clearly the moral realist won't want to allow this. If the natural properties are the same, the moral properties must be the same. If we allow that moral properties can differ without any difference of natural properties, then moral properties just sort of float free in a domain all of their own. You know, we'd never know the moral value of anything. So, although moral properties are a very unusual kind of property, they're not natural properties. They have a strong dependence on natural properties. They supervene on them. Okay, let's look at G.E. Moore and his defence of non-naturalism. Moore defended a version of non-naturalism called intuitionism, and the reason for that name will become clear as we explore his work. Just bear in mind that non-naturalism can come in other varieties. What does it mean to say that something is good? When I say that giving to charity is good, what does this mean? Well, according to Moore, we simply can't answer this question, because goodness is simple or unanalysable. We can't define the term good. Think about something we can define, like bachelor. A bachelor is an unmarried man. We can break the concept bachelor down into constituent parts, unmarried and man. Now, for Moore, there are some concepts we can't break down. His example is yellow. What is yellow? Imagine trying to explain to a blind person what yellowness is. Where would you even start? I mean, I guess we could talk about particular wavelengths of light or properties of the surfaces of objects, but neither of these really get at what the word yellow means. Even if yellow, is light at a particular wavelength, that's not what the word yellow means. It seems like all we can say here is that if you don't know what yellowness is, then you're never going to know. I mean, there's nothing we can say to help you. Yellow is a simple, unanalysable property. We can't break it down into parts. We can't define it. Similarly, according to Moore, we can't define good. At least in the context of statements like giving to charity is good, it's not possible to define what good means. We all know what it means, just as we all know what yellowness is, but we can't analyse it. More's argument for this is the open question argument. This is one of the most famous arguments in metaethics. So More distinguishes between open questions and closed questions. With closed questions, the answer is decided by the mere meaning of the words. Suppose somebody asks, "Are bachelors unmarried?" That's a weird question. It would imply that the questioner just doesn't know what the words mean. I mean, of course bachelors are unmarried. That's how the word is defined. Or imagine if somebody says, "Well, I agree that Frank is a bachelor, but is Frank unmarried?" Again, that would be a silly question. It'd be a weird question to ask. A question is open if its answer is not decided by the meanings of the terms. Is Frank at the beach? I know it was a film, but was it fictional? He's attracted to her, but does he love her? These aren't silly questions, and the reason why they're not silly is because the answers don't simply depend on definitions. The concept of film does not include the concept fictional. There can be documentary films. The concept of attraction doesn't include the concept of love. You can be attracted to people you don't love. You might even hate them. The distinction between open and closed questions is important because if we can define X as Y, then the question, is an X a Y, will be closed. Bachelor is defined to mean unmarried man. So when we ask, are bachelors unmarried, this is a closed question. If the question, is an X a Y, is open, if that's a significant question, then the meaning of Y is not part of the meaning of X. We can't define X as Y. He's attracted to her, but does he love her? Is clearly an open question, and this shows that love isn't simply defined as attraction. There's more to love than attraction. With this in mind, More argues that for any purported definition of good, that definition will be subject to open questions. Suppose we're attracted to utilitarianism, and we say that the good is whatever maximises pleasure, so that what the statement "giving to charity is good" means is giving to charity maximises pleasure. It's easy to generate open questions about this. Consider scenarios like trolley problems where you can kill one person to save 5. You can say, well, I agree that killing one man to save 5 would maximise pleasure, but is killing one man to save 5 good? That's a perfectly reasonable question. But if it were true that good means maximises pleasure, then that question would be silly. It would be like saying, Frank is a bachelor, but is Frank unmarried? So we can't define goodness as pleasure maximisation. Goodness and pleasure maximisation are two different things. Let's apply this to some of the meta-ethical views that we've seen. Individualist subjectivism is the view that X is good means I approve of X. When we make value judgments, we simply report our own attitudes. Well, More would point out that I approve of X, but is X good? Is a perfectly reasonable question. There's nothing contradictory or confused about it. People can legitimately ask whether the things they approve of are good. Cultural subjectivism says that X is good means my culture approves of X, but you can legitimately say, my culture approves of X, but is X good? Ideal observer theory says that X is good means X would be approved of by an ideal observer, but you can legitimately say, X would be approved of by an ideal observer, but is X good? And so on. All of these theories fail. According to More, any theory along these lines will fail. Any attempt to define good in terms of something else will fail. All we can say is that good is good. That's it. We can't define it. Goodness is not reducible to anything else. More says that anybody who attempts to give a definition of good commits what he calls the naturalistic fallacy. Now, this is quite badly named, because More argues against giving any definition of good, not just against defining it in terms of natural properties. So if you attempt to define good in terms of non-natural properties, you've committed the naturalistic fallacy too. Think about divine command theory, according to which X is good means X is commanded by God. Well, God is a supernatural being. God's commands are non-natural. For More, this would also be an example of the naturalistic fallacy, because we can say, without any conceptual confusion, X is commanded by God, but is X good? So although Moore calls it the naturalistic fallacy, keep in mind that he argues that goodness is not reducible to anything else. It cannot be defined in terms of anything else, neither natural things nor non-natural things. Goodness is a basic, unanalysable property. I think there was a philosopher who suggested that this should be called the definist fallacy, and that would probably be a better name. It's also worth noting that Moore's argument would apply to many other value terms, such as bad and beautiful. We can't define what badness is. Goodness and badness are simple, unanalysable. They're non-natural. Okay? If they were natural properties, then we'd be able to define them. We'd be able to define them in terms of the natural properties that they are. Now, that's the open question argument. Moore thinks he's shown that goodness is a non-natural property and an irreducible non-natural property. I want to mention an initial problem for this argument. We'll look at more serious problems in the next video, but I think there's an immediate problem that's worth mentioning. Let's grant that the open question argument is completely successful. Does it actually show that goodness is a simple, unanalysable property? Well, Moore himself points out that there are actually three options on the table. So first, as Moore suggests, goodness could be a simple, unanalysable property like yellow. Second, it could be a complex, analysable property that we can define in terms of other things, like bachelor. Or third, perhaps it's not a property at all. Perhaps the word goodness simply has no literal meaning, so that to say giving to charity is good is not really to express a meaningful proposition. Now, if the open question argument is successful, it refutes the second option. But what about the third? Well, it's perfectly compatible with the third. If we hold that good simply has no meaning, if we hold that goodness isn't a property at all, well, obviously we won't be able to define the term good, and we won't be able to show that goodness can be reduced to other properties. You should recognise this kind of view because we've seen it already with emotivism. According to emotivism, moral statements aren't literally meaningful. They don't express propositions. To say that giving to charity is good is just to say, yay for giving to charity. There is no property of goodness. Emotivists actually used Moore's open question argument to defend emotivism. If you read Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic, he explicitly uses the open question argument to object to various accounts of metaethics. So Moore needs a separate argument against this third option. Unfortunately, he doesn't really seem to have one. He seems to think it's just obvious if you reflect on statements about goodness. Of course they're perfectly meaningful. Of course goodness is a property. It's just self-evident. When we think about goodness, we evidently have a distinct idea in our minds, so it must be meaningful. Obviously, that's not really persuasive these days, after a very kind of sophisticated emotivist tradition has emerged. To be fair on Moore, he was writing just at the turn of the century, before emotivism had been developed. I mean, I guess it had a precursor in Hume, but there are other ways of taking Hume's work. Anyway, if you want to defend the Moorean position, obviously you can't just appeal to the open question argument. You need other arguments against emotivism and other forms of non-cognitivism. Anyway, Moore felt that his open question argument establishes that goodness is a non-natural property. We can't define goodness in terms of any natural properties. It's something over and above the natural world. Of course, we can't define it in terms of any other non-natural properties either. But it's not a natural property. Now, this has some interesting consequences. Cast your mind back to the introductory video. We saw the is-ought gap and the fact-value distinction. Moore accepts the is-ought gap. You can't derive a normative claim from purely descriptive premises. Since good and bad and other value terms are not definable in terms of any other properties, then no premises about any of those other properties will alone be sufficient to derive a normative conclusion. If you want a normative conclusion, you need normative premises. However, Moore rejects the fact-value distinction. Values, according to Moore, are facts. It's a fact that some things are good or bad. How do we access these normative facts? Well, Moore says they're just self-evident. We know them by intuition. When I say slavery is wrong or giving to charity is good, these statements are self-evidently true. We see their truth with our mind's eyes as clearly as we see that grass is green. This is why More's view is called intuitionism. Morality is fundamentally based on our intuitions. Intuitions give us access to moral facts. A couple of points here to clarify the position. First of all, what is an intuition? The way that philosophers tend to use this term, one thing intuition involves is having a kind of gut feeling. To say that I have the intuition that P is to say that it seems to be the case that P, or that I'm inclined to believe that P. There's a bit more involved though, because one way you can be inclined to believe something is because of your sense impressions. If I have the sense impression of a blue car-shaped object moving through the trees in front of me, I'll be inclined to believe that there's a blue car there. I think most philosophers would say that this isn't an intuition because intuition isn't based on any sensory modalities. So as a sort of broad definition, we can say that intuition is a non-sensory seeming. Okay, so things can see something that seems to be the case for us, where this isn't based on any of our sense impressions. It's based on our intellect. So we know moral facts, we come to know moral facts by engaging our intellect. We don't literally see them or literally hear them. A second thing to note is that the intuitionist does not have to say that every moral statement is known by intuition. He simply holds that some moral statements are known by intuition, and we may use reasoning to get to other moral statements. W.D. Ross, a famous intuitionist, drew an analogy to mathematics. Mathematics, according to Ross, is fundamentally based on intuitions. We just know intuitively, it's just self-evident that 1 plus 1 equals 2. If you have 1 and you have another 1, you can't fail to have 2. And that's as plain as day to all of us, at least all of us who are old enough to know what numbers are. Now another sum, such as 1,326 plus 869 equals 2,222, that's probably not intuitively obvious. But you can acquire knowledge of this sum by sort of building up from intuitively obvious foundations like 1 plus 1 equals 2. You start from the intuitively obvious foundations, the axioms, and then you build up to stuff that isn't intuitively obvious. So similarly, consider, abortion is wrong. Well, surely that's not intuitively obvious. Even if it's true, there's too much disagreement about that for it to be intuition. But some judgments that underlie this plausibly are intuitive. Something like killing humans without good reason is bad. This is a sort of claim that the intuitionist would say is self-evident, and somebody might appeal to this claim in arguing that abortion is wrong. W.D. Ross held that morality is based on what he calls prima facie duties. By a prima facie duty, Ross means that these duties can be overridden. They're not absolutely inviolable and binding no matter what the circumstances. Prima facie duties are just sort of guidelines for actions. So a few of Ross's prima facie duties, as listed on his Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy page, are: we should strive to keep our promises and be honest and truthful. We should refrain from harming others either physically or psychologically. We should be kind to others and try to improve their health, wisdom, security, happiness, and well-being. We should try to be fair and to distribute benefits and burdens equitably and evenly. There are a few others, but you get the idea. For Ross, these are all true. These are all statements of fact. Now, each of them can be overridden in particular cases because they may conflict with each other. For instance, the duty not to harm others may conflict with the duty to distribute benefits and burdens equally. Imagine somebody hoarding a load of money that's owed to other people. We might have to harm him in order to get the money. We will have to coerce him into handing over the money. So for Ross, there's a lot of room for moral debate and moral conflict. In any particular concrete situation, we can disagree about what we should do because it might not be clear how to apply our prima facie duties to a particular case. But Ross would insist that at the foundation of legitimate moral debates will be his prima facie duties. And these prima facie duties are known by intuition. We just know intuitively that prima facie it's bad to harm people. that prima facie we should keep our promises, that prima facie we should make amends to people we've wronged, and so on. And in most cases, it's obvious how to apply these. I mean, I just see that it would be wrong to stab a random person in the face. I have a prima facie duty not to harm people, and if I'm walking down the street on an average day, obviously nothing overrides that duty. But a question like, should abortion be illegal? Well, okay, if we make abortion illegal, this will prevent pregnant women from harming the fetus. On the other hand, would it prevent harm? I mean, people still seek out abortions even when they're illegal. And anyway, does the state have the right to harm a woman by forcing her to carry out a pregnancy she doesn't want? And so on. I mean, in this case, a mere appeal to prima facie duties doesn't seem to decide the issue, because there's a lot of messiness and conflict. But the prima facie duties are known by intuition. Okay, well that's moral non-naturalism, and we'll look at some criticisms of the open question argument in particular, and moral non-naturalism more generally in the next video. I think that's enough for today. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.